Welcome to Short Stories. I'm your host, Martin. Today's story is drawn from one of the most popular operas in the West, Madame Butterfly. This opera was composed by Giacomo Puccini and it premiered in 1904 in Milan, Italy. Puccini supposedly got the idea for this opera from a play, which was in turn based on a short story about a doomed love affair between a Japanese woman and an American sailor. He asked his publisher to obtain the operatic rights to the story in 1901. Puccini and his assistants took great care when crafting the story and the set designs. His colleague even traveled to Nagasaki, Japan to learn the local color palette. Meanwhile, Puccini consulted with the wife of the Japanese ambassador to Italy about traditional Japanese music. The end result of all this hard work is an opera that is still performed today. This story has been modified from its original version. It has been formatted to fit this screen. Vocabulary. Come a long way. Come a long way. After 3 years of lessons, your piano skills have come a long way. Consul. Consul. Anna was appointed consul for the Sapporo region. Lease. Lease. We signed a lease on a new apartment last week. Odds and ends. Odds and ends. Their closet was stuffed with odds and ends. Outrage. Outrage. The CEO tried to calm the public outrage over his company's chemical spill. Tantamount. Tantamount. An attack on one member of NATO is tantamount to an attack on all members of NATO. Timorously. Timorously. She timorously opened the attic door, hoping that the ghost stories were all false. Veranda. Veranda. We sat on the veranda and admired the view. The story. In a house on a hill overlooking Nagasaki Harbor stood an American naval officer and a Japanese broker. Junior Lieutenant Benjamin F. Pinkerton was listening to his broker, Goro, explain the details of his lease and his upcoming marriage. The young sailor smiled triumphantly as he signed the final document. "This is Suzuki," said Goro as he pointed to a boy who was bowing very low. "He will serve you for as long as you live in this house." Pinkerton ordered Suzuki to fetch him a cold drink and watched with pleasure as the boy ran out of the room to fulfill the request. "And this is the guest list for your wedding," continued Goro, changing the subject. Pinkerton cleared his throat and said, "You'll have to explain it to me. I can't read Japanese." Goro read the names on the list and explained their relationship to the bride. Pinkerton nodded silently. The broker's recitation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Sharpless, the U.S. consul stationed in Nagasaki. "Congratulations, old chum," said Sharpless as he slapped Pinkerton's shoulder. "I heard about your engagement, and I thought I'd stop by." Pinkerton smiled broadly and ordered Suzuki to get another drink for his friend. The two men then sat in large chairs on the veranda and admired the view of Nagasaki Harbor. "This is a dandy house you've got," exclaimed Mr. Sharpless. "Wait till you see the lease," replied Pinkerton. "It lasts 99 years, and I can cancel any time. Contracts are flexible in Japan." Mr. Sharpless took a sip of his drink before asking about Pinkerton's fiancée. "Who is the lucky future Mrs. Pinkerton?" he asked. "I can't pronounce her name in Japanese, so I just call her Butterfly," answered Pinkerton. He then went on to explain how they had met at a party hosted by the Japanese government. I took an immediate liking to her, he said. It was Mr. Goro who actually proposed the marriage, he continued, and I said, "You only live once." Mr. Sharpless furrowed his brow and looked Pinkerton in the eyes. "Are you sure about this, Ben? I mean, do you even love her?" Pinkerton took a sip of his drink as he thought of a reply. "What is love anyway, Sharp?" he began. "All I know is that she is beautiful and I enjoy her company." Mr. Sharpless took another sip of his drink and said, "You're a sailor, Ben. Your job requires you to travel the globe. You may not be here long enough to enjoy her company." Pinkerton sighed, looked at his friend, and said, "Then it's a good thing that Japanese marriage contracts are as flexible as their leases." He then lifted his glass and proposed a toast to America. The two men clinked their glasses and sang a patriotic song. The wedding was held on the following day. Many guests arrived at the house, including Mr. Sharpless, several Japanese officials, Butterfly's mother, her uncle Yakuside, and her jealous cousins. Later, Goro announced the arrival of Butterfly herself. She softly entered the house and bowed to Pinkerton and Mr. Sharpless, who awkwardly returned the gesture. Sharpless asked Pinkerton about Butterfly's family. "Her dad was some kind of big shot, I think," he replied with a shrug. Goro stepped in to clarify that Butterfly's father was a nobleman, but the family had fallen on hard times recently. "What happened to her father?" asked Sharpless. "Dead," answered Butterfly in English. She then spoke in Japanese about the love she had for her soon-to-be husband, and about how she had gone against her mother's wishes and converted to Christianity, with Goro translating. As a kind of exclamation point to her whole story, she added, "I love you," in English. Pinkerton blushed and gently lifted up his bride from her bowed position. The marriage ceremony was held in the garden of the house, with the bride and groom standing on the veranda. It was a brief but beautiful scene. After the ceremony, everyone enjoyed a good meal and some drinks. "Don't go breaking her heart, Ben," warned Sharpless. Pinkerton shrugged off this comment and replied, "It'll be fine." Just then, a loud commotion was heard from the other side of the room. It was Yakuside shouting and raving about Butterfly. "He's drunk again," cried Goro. "I may be drunk," yelled Yakuside in Japanese, "but I'm sober enough to see that Butterfly has betrayed her family. This marriage is an outrage." Some of the other male guests converged on Yakuside in order to get him under control. But Yakuside was not intimidated and kept yelling accusations against Butterfly, who was now covering her face and crying. Mr. Sharpless and the other male guests forcibly escorted Yakuside out of the house, and the party ended. Once all the guests had left, Pinkerton tried his best to comfort Butterfly. "Don't worry about it. My folks don't like me either," he said, uncertain that she understood his words. He then caressed her hand and gave her a gentle kiss. This cheered her up, and the two sang a lovely duet as the sun set over Mount Inasa. Suzuki was kneeling and praying before a statue of Buddha in a back room of the Pinkerton house. As Butterfly walked by, she scolded the boy for trusting lazy gods. "My husband's God answers prayers much more quickly," she asserted. Suzuki stopped his prayers and turned to face his mistress. "It's been 3 years since Mr. Pinkerton left on his assignment," said Suzuki. "The money he left for us is nearly all gone. If he doesn't return soon, we'll be forced to beg in the streets." Butterfly scolded her servant once again and said, "Of course Mr. Pinkerton will return. He promised to return when the robins build their nests, and I just saw a robin this morning." Suzuki turned back to the statue of Buddha and muttered, "Foreign husbands never return." Ignoring Suzuki's pessimism, Butterfly turned to look out the window overlooking the harbor and sang a lovely tune about the day her husband would come home. This song was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mr. Sharpless. "Welcome, Mr. Sharpless," said Butterfly in English, "to my American home." Mr. Sharpless entered and greeted Butterfly half-heartedly. "Your English has come a long way, Madam Butterfly," he said. Butterfly thanked him for the compliment and offered him a seat and a drink. Mr. Sharpless declined and said, "I'm afraid this isn't a social visit. I have a letter from Ben that—" "My husband is returning?" interrupted Butterfly excitedly. Mr. Sharpless smiled awkwardly and said, "Not exactly. I think it's best that I read the letter to you." But Butterfly was already rushing to and fro, ordering Suzuki to decorate the house for the return of Mr. Pinkerton. There was a second knock at the door. Suzuki answered it and announced the arrival of Goro. "Not him again," complained Butterfly. "He is a really bad man, you know," she said, turning to Mr. Sharpless. "Over the past year, he has continually pestered me about getting remarried. I keep telling him that I am already married, but he doesn't listen." Mr. Sharpless looked at her anxiously and was about to say something when Goro spoke up. "I have come once again on behalf of Yamadori to ask for your hand in marriage," announced the broker. Butterfly gave Goro the cold shoulder and declared, "I already gave him my answer." Goro cleared his throat and said, "It's been 3 years, Madam Butterfly, since your husband abandoned you. Under Japanese law, that's tantamount to a divorce." Butterfly whipped around angrily and yelled, "He'll come back, you'll see, and when he does, he'll give you a good thrashing." Seeing that there was no way to talk sense into her, Goro bowed politely and left. Mr. Sharpless pulled out the letter from his pocket and said, "You need to hear this, Madam Butterfly," and began to read. "Dear Butterfly, I regret to inform you that I won't be returning. I have been reassigned to the port of San Francisco, where I met a lovely American woman who has agreed to be my wife. Please forgive—" "Is that a robin I see making a nest?" interrupted Butterfly. She ran to the window and pointed excitedly at a small gray and red bird in a nearby tree. "Butterfly, please listen," begged Mr. Sharpless as he continued reading. "Please forgive me for not writing to you sooner. I have been gone so long. I figured you have probably forgotten me by now." "How could I ever forget my dear husband?" interrupted Butterfly once again. "He's so silly sometimes. I want you to write back to him and tell him how excited I and his son are to see him." Mr. Sharpless, stunned, asked timidly, "Your son?" Butterfly called to Suzuki to bring in her son, a 2.5-year-old boy with blue eyes. "I call him Trouble," announced Butterfly as she picked the boy up and held him happily in her arms. But when his father comes home, I'll call him Happy." Mr. Sharpless was too shocked for words. He could feel his own heart breaking on Butterfly's behalf. After a long pause, he finally asked, "What would you do if Ben never came back?" Butterfly's smile disappeared from her face, and she replied, "I'd have only two choices. Either I work as a geisha to make ends meet, or I kill myself." After that comment, Mr. Sharpless lost all courage to tell Butterfly the terrible news. He bowed and took his leave. "Please write to Ben about his son," said Butterfly as Mr. Sharpless exited the house. Butterfly stood for several minutes looking at Trouble in her arms. "Your father will come and take us far away from here," she said to her child. "Maybe he will take us to live in America." Suddenly she heard a cannon fire in the harbor. She turned and looked excitedly out the window. "Did you hear that, Trouble?" she said. "That means your father's ship has returned." Butterfly quickly ran to Suzuki and ordered the house to be made ready. She then changed into her most beautiful outfit, combed and dressed her son, and knelt before her front door, eagerly awaiting the return of her errant husband. Butterfly kept vigil by the door all night. When dawn broke the following day, Suzuki, who had fallen asleep, roused himself and nudged his mistress. "He'll come," she murmured. Suzuki then pointed to Trouble, who had fallen asleep on the floor next to his mother. Butterfly stood up awkwardly, her legs stiff from kneeling all night, and picked up her child and took him back to his bed. Before Suzuki could go to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, he heard a light tap at the door. He answered it and was shocked to see Mr. Sharpless and Pinkerton. "Shh!" intoned Pinkerton. Mr. Sharpless knelt down to Suzuki's level and explained in Japanese that they needed his help. "We need you to convince Butterfly to accept that her marriage with Mr. Pinkerton is over," he explained. "He has found a new wife," he said as he pointed to a woman standing behind Pinkerton. The woman stepped forward and gave an awkward bow. "This is Kate," explained Mr. Sharpless. "She will be Trouble's new mother. Can you explain all this to Butterfly?" Suzuki was not mature enough for such a task, and he was old enough to know it. He refused at first, but Mr. Sharpless insisted. Finally, Suzuki relented and went to look for his mistress. Pinkerton began to crack as he watched the boy disappear into the back room. "I can't stand to see her face," he muttered as he tried to hide his tears with his hands. Kate tried to comfort him, but it just made him feel worse. He turned and ran from the house. "Let him go," Mr. Sharpless said, grabbing Kate by the shoulder. Mr. Sharpless put on a sympathetic face for Pinkerton, but inside he was cursing him for his selfish stupidity. Suddenly, Butterfly came rushing into the room with a wild look in her eyes. "Where is he? Is he here?" she asked desperately. Her eyes frantically searched the room, but all she could see were Suzuki, Mr. Sharpless, and a strange woman. "What's going on?" Butterfly demanded. Mr. Sharpless tried to explain as gently as he could that Butterfly's marriage to Mr. Pinkerton was over, and that Kate would take good care of Trouble from now on. Kate stepped forward timorously and said, "I'm sorry to do this, but he will have the most loving home a boy could ask for." Butterfly, her heart pounding inside her chest, calmly said, "Don't be sorry for me, but if Mr. Pinkerton wants to pick up his son, please tell him to come and do it himself." She then bowed and politely asked the two visitors to leave. Once Mr. Sharpless and Kate were gone, Butterfly took her young son to the Buddha shrine in the back of the house. After lighting a candle and saying a short prayer, she handed the child to Suzuki and asked to be left alone until Pinkerton returned. Finally alone, Butterfly let her emotions pour out of her. She wept bitterly as she searched through the cabinet of old odds and ends. She paused when she found that what she was looking for, her father's old ceremonial knife. She picked up the box that contained the knife and gently wiped her finger across the golden inscription that read, "Die with honor when it is no longer possible to live with honor." Butterfly sang a tearful song as she slowly removed the blade from its container. She took a deep breath before she jabbed it into her stomach. As she lay on the floor bleeding, she could hear Pinkerton's voice calling for her. She was too weak to respond. Pinkerton came rushing in and shouted, "Butterfly, don't do it!" Seeing her on the floor, pale and barely alive, he fell down on his knees and embraced her one last time. "What have I done?" cried Pinkerton, tears streaming down his face. Mr. Sharpless wasn't far behind, and he just about fell to pieces when he saw the tragic scene. But, pulling himself together, he went to Suzuki and asked for Trouble. Taking the child in his arms, he gave him a gentle kiss on the forehead and said, "From now on, your name shall be Happy." Questions. Number 1. Who proposed the marriage between Pinkerton and Butterfly? A. Pinkerton. B. Butterfly. C. Mr. Sharpless. D. Goro. The answer is D, Goro. Question 2. Why was Yakuside angry at Butterfly? A. He wanted to marry her, but she refused. B. He wanted her to marry Goro instead. C. He thought her marriage to a foreigner was an outrage. D. He wanted more wine. The answer is C. He thought her marriage to a foreigner was an outrage. Question 3. Why did Goro propose that Butterfly remarry? A. He wanted to marry her. B. He wanted her to marry Mr. Sharpless. C. Pinkerton had died. D. Pinkerton had abandoned her. The answer is D. Pinkerton had abandoned her. Question 4. What name did Butterfly give her son? A. Happy. B. Joy. C. Luck. D. Trouble. The answer is D. Trouble.